Thanks. Here.
This is big brain time.
If I ever had to properly narrow down my top 5 video games of all time, I think without a doubt one game that would always make the list is Metal Gear Solid 3. Developed by Konami and what's really become Hideo Kojima's masterpiece, it's the prequel to the entire Metal Gear saga. And not only just one of the best games for the PlayStation 2, but really just one of the best games ever made in general. Its legacy is proved in the fact that people are still talking about it and that they've been clamoring for a proper remake for years now. And with the recent news that Konami seem to be doing just that with the upcoming Metal Gear Solid Delta, there's never been a better time to go back and take a look at the original.
Here's where the fun really begins.
It's one of those things that I just can't help but keep coming back to, and I know every man and his dog has gone through the motions singing its praises on YouTube for years now, and I doubt I'll even go about half as deep as some of those videos have.
Fine, have this.
But how about just for the next half hour or so, you indulge me and listen to what a grumpy 37-year-old boomer has to say about one of his absolute favourite games.
I've been waiting for this.
Now, although this is a prequel to everything that came before it, it doesn't mean it's just the kind of thing that anyone can pick up and get right into. And it does require a pretty good understanding of what's going on to get the most out of it.
Oh, I can't hold it anymore.
That said, being set at the beginning of the whole timeline does make it more accessible, as it doesn't have all the baggage of the previous games, at least not on the surface. It's kind of funny playing through it now in 2023 when you consider all the stuff that's gone on with the Marvel and the DC cinematic universes, because back then in 2004, and even earlier than that in 2001, it really was like Kojima was creating his own cinematic universe before that was even like a thing.
I am Shalashaska, also called Revolver Ocelot.
With all these characters and factions popping up in each game, and Hideo always finding a way to fill in the blanks and add in even more backstory about the whole thing clicks together. I mean, we even got those old post-credit stingers.
Goodbye, Mr. President.
Plus, I've always kind of thought of the MGS games as kind of like the Back to the Future movies, in the way that they span multiple time periods and always seem to find a way to bring back the same protagonists and characters.
Hey, McFly!
Particularly Ocelot, who's really in this case the Biff Tannen of the Metal Gear Solid universe.
What are you looking at, butthead?
It's like in every one of the Back to the Future movies where Marty McFly ends up at that cafe in downtown Hill Valley before Biff shows up, with whatever entourage of douchebags he has at that time to throw a spanner in the works.
Something very familiar about all this.
And also too, much like how the third Back to the Future movie went the most back in time, so does Metal Gear Solid 3. From the futuristic year of 2007 in MGS2 to the mid-1960s in Metal Gear Solid 3. This time focusing on Big Boss before he was even Big Boss. I mean, he wasn't even called Little Boss, he was just a guy named Jack, coincidentally given the code name of Naked Snake.
Your code name for this mission will be Naked Snake.
And at that point, you really got to think that Kojima's just taken the piss, right? I mean, we've got Solid, Liquid, Solidus, and now Naked Snake. I mean, all we're missing is Flaccid Snake.
What, you don't like snakes?
It's also showing the guy at a point before he was one of the primary antagonists, showing how he lost his way and became that tragic villain, and it's kind of like seeing Anakin Skywalker before he became Darth Vader, or Martha Stewart before she committed tax evasion. The story is that Snake's heading into Russia to extract a scientist named Sokolov who's developing a super mega powerful weapon called the Shagohod.
I've come to escort you back to the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Now this thing's a nuclear-equipped walking battle tank capable of launching missiles from any kind of terrain. Sound familiar? Yeah, it should. He's being assisted by his mentor, legendary soldier and motherly figure named the Boss, not to be confused with the overrated Bruce Springsteen, and she's responsible for teaching him pretty much everything he knows. The only catch is that she's got plans of her own. Because as it turns out, the Boss is defecting to Russia, and as proof of her allegiance to her new benefactors, she turns Sokolov over to the Russians and the sadistic Colonel Volgin, and also brings along her old former Special Forces unit, the Cobras, with these guys being the pain, the fear, the end, the sorrow, and the fury.
Let us fight together again.
Snake does his best to stop her, but pretty much has his ass handed to him, has his arm broken for his troubles, and is then thrown from the top of a rope bridge by someone he always looked up to and thought he could trust. And Volgin, being the absolute piece of shit that he is, launches a nuclear missile to instigate a war between Russia and the United States. So damn dog, not an ideal day on the job for old mate Snake. Though it does explain how we first got that bandana, so that's something at least. After this, Snake is then sent back in about a week or so later with the same objective, only this time to also bring his former teacher to justice for her crimes, along with stopping Volgan and proving America's innocence in that whole missile attack. But, you know, anyone who's played any of these games knows it's never that simple, and there's far more going on here than meets the eye, because the boss's true motives are far from being that one-sided. And yeah, she's a pretty interesting character, without ever feeling like her skill and expertise is shoehorned in on account of her gender. And whenever you hear some brain-dead idiot bitching online about how there's not enough strong, powerful female characters in gaming, well, tell them to Google the boss. You know, in case a character literally being called the boss wasn't a dead giveaway.
Go home.
And also, while you're at it, maybe tell them to Google, you know, Meryl Silverberg, Olga Galukovich, Jill Valentine, Claire Redfield, Ada Wong, Lara Croft, Tifa Lockhart, Samus Aran, Kate Archer, Joanna Dark, Heather Mason, Alex Vance, Faith Connors, Mona Sachs, you get the point. Metal Gear Solid 3 also introduces Eva, Snake's ambiguously allied companion, who's supposed to be like a double or triple agent or something. Either way though, she seems to be on his side when it matters the most, and the two of them end up working together in more ways than one.
When this mission's over, you'll have to treat me to a nice dinner.
Disgusting.
I will admit though that the whole Snake and Eva thing, with it being a bit of a play on the Adam, Eve and Snake in the Garden of Eden, is a bit on the nose. But then again, subtlety in these games has never really been Kojima's strong suit. Considering you've got a revolver-wielding bad guy just named Revolver Ocelot. Yeah, how does he come up with these creative titles?
Special Operations Foxhound. Revolver Ocelot.
And actually too, speaking of Ocelot, we get to see him in this game as a cocky, arrogant little shithead, heading up his own Special Forces unit and really acting like a bit of a spoiled brat.
That's Major Ocelot to you.
Seeing him getting bodied by Snake numerous times is pretty funny, but also from his perspective, seeing Snake best him and survive these countless scenarios that probably should kill a normal man. At that point, you can start to understand why Ocelot formed such a man crush on him, and why his allegiances would eventually shift.
Do you hear me? I said shoot him!
Sorry, Colonel. I'm afraid I can't do that.
So either way, this is without a doubt some of the most memorable versions of these characters, and the voice acting across the board is just really top-notch stuff.
Pretty good.
With David Hayter returning yet again to voice Snake.
Hey, this works.
It also makes sense that he's front and center yet again, because whenever there's a Metal Gear Solid game, you can bet your bottom dollar that a Snake ain't too far behind.
There's nothing here.
And it is interesting seeing this guy's backstory getting filled in, considering that Big Boss has always had a pretty pivotal role in the franchise. In the first couple of games, he was the main antagonist. In MGS1, Solid and Liquid Snake only exist because they were his clones in the first place. And Liquid's whole master plan was based off Big Boss's ideals and a means of trying to get revenge on a father that he felt mistreated him. Yeah, classic daddy issues.
Now I'll finish the work that Father began.
In Metal Gear Solid 2, Solidus was yet another clone of Big Boss who was trying to take down the Patriots, that clandestine organization that Big Boss also sought to destroy.
I'll drown you fools for interfering!
So it's kind of fitting that Konami chose to go back to where the whole thing started.
Commencing virtuous mission now.
Before Big Boss even earned that title, and it's a well-known fact that the 1960s aesthetic is one of the comfiest ones of all time. Just ask Kate Archer.
Certainly not.
But it's the way that the game seems to reuse a lot of those familiar themes and motives that makes it also enjoyable. And you might notice how all of these games always seem to have some very similar key moments.
Answer me.
For starters, they always start off with the main character dropped into the mission area by themselves, to soon be helped out by a woman whose motivations aren't fully known at that point. An early boss fight involves a shootout, often with Ocelot, or in the case of MGS2, another Russian, in the form of Olga Galukovich. Later in the game, the main character gets tortured with electricity, before then having to break out of confinement by getting past a weak bowel-suffering prison guard.
Oh, my stomach! Oh.
And then it all ends in a fight against a large mech suit capable of launching nukes. In MGS1, it was Metal Gear Rex. In MGS2, it was the Metal Gear Rays. Lots of Metal Gear Rays. And now on MGS3, it's the Shagohod. But what makes MGS3 different is that it feels by this point they've finally cracked how to bring all of this stuff together and make it play out in the most cohesive way. So all of the backtracking and the blatant filler from MGS1 is more or less gone. Then the repetition in the environments from MGS2, exploring the same struts of the Big Shell oil rig over and over, also gone. The light Metroidvania elements in the previous games have been replaced with this more succinct journey through an actual place, with a subtle night and day cycle emphasizing the amount of time you're spending on the mission and really making it feel more believable. In fact, it's really just like an outright immersive sim at this point, letting the player mess around with more or less a fully interactive world.
Huh? What's that sound?
It just finally feels like they found a happy medium between telling a lengthy and thorough story, but then also allowing the player to feel like they're actually spending enough time playing through it, as opposed to sitting there and watching literal talking heads or running back and forth to a furnace to change the color of a fucking POW key.
I deactivated it.
The best example of that is just how few mandatory codec calls there are this time. Despite there actually being more codec calls in total compared to MGS2, now there's far less of them throughout the main campaign you're forced to listen to. Plus they're also spaced out better too, making it less exhausting to sit through them.
You've gotta be kidding me.
The most egregious example in MGS2 was during that whole sequence when you were disarming all of those bombs, and it felt like after every single one of these, Raiden had to check in with Snake and Stillman to give them an update or something.
Raiden here. I took care of the C4 in Strut C.
Shut up!
Some of the earlier ones in this third game are kinda lengthy, but they're really just there to make sure you understand what your objective is. It's never just talking for the sake of talking, and when someone else calls in at random to talk to Snake, they're calling for a specific reason and to share details that the player needs to know.
Will you give it a rest?
And that's a good thing because it means you can spend more time playing the game, as opposed to twiddling your thumbs while the characters talk to each other like they've started up their own fucking podcast.
This is Raiden. The C4 found in Strut A has been frozen and disposed of.
Even still though, they've left in that aspect where you can call someone up at random, where they'll often come up with some useful tidbits of information or just offer up a random moment of levity.
Hey, you've got thermal goggles, don't you? Use those and it should make it easier to find the end, even when he's camouflaged.
Speaking of jokes as well, MGS3 again showcases the series' well-known and often bizarre sense of humor, with fourth wall breaking remarks, meta moments, plus all that harmless, crude sexual stuff. Like seeing a character who's a very clear reference to Raiden wearing a leather thong that's got a lightning bolt on it. I don't know, just because.
Who are you?
There's even a whole sequence where you're disguised as this guy, and can even go around bullying all of these poor soldiers and scientists. And because you're their superior officer, they'll even thank you for the ass whooping.
Forgive me for troubling you, sir.
One of the new mechanics is being able to see certain cinematics through Snake's perspective by holding down the R1 button. And whenever you're interacting with Eva, it's common for Snake to just have his eyes locked right onto those baby bumpers, as if the guy's never seen a pair of cans before.
The name's Eva.
I appreciate what you're showing me right now.
But in this case, it also actually works with Eva's character, being this alluring, mysterious Bond girl trope that's got her own mission goal she's working towards, using her assets here as best she can to keep Snake off his game.
We've got company. It's the Ocelot unit. Let's get out of here. Hurry.
And if anything, it's actually probably a bit of a power play that he stares so much. I mean, if you think about it, he's really just asserting his dominance, and a weaker man would have taken the easy route, and instead held eye contact with Eva the entire time, but yes, son, not this guy.
You've gotta be kidding me.
I also find it really funny how in almost every single MGS game, there's some kind of scene where Snake gets a hard-on when talking about a weapon.
Incredible.
I think if someone ever gave this guy a gun with boobs on it, well, he'd probably have a goddamn heart attack.
And not only that, nearly every part of this gun has been expertly crafted and customized.
Whoa, slow down, egghead.
Jokes aside though, the story is mostly about Snake trying to prevent World War III after Colonel Volgin unexpectedly launched that missile, which understandably, pissed a few people off. Volgin is really a nasty piece of work as well. He's kind of like what would happen if Ivan Drago and Lord Raiden from Mortal Kombat had a love child, and then if that love child had butted a sanding belt. And he's easily one of the most villainous characters in probably the entire series. When you look at Liquid Snake and even Solidus, despite being clear-cut bad guys, they were still working towards some kind of warped vision of what they thought Big Boss's ideal vision of the world was.
Damn the Patriots!
Volgin, on the other hand, is just a complete asshole, and he just wants to launch nukes and watch the world burn.
We can't let him live.
The scene where he absolutely beats the shit out of Snake is where I really started to hate this guy. And I finished this game probably like a dozen or so times, and I've only ever sat through that scene twice. The first time was obviously when I first played the game, and then the second time was when I was capturing footage of that scene for this video. I mean, that's how nasty it is. I'm not going to show the whole thing here, but if you really want to see a grown man have his skull methodically bashed in by a maniacal tyrant, well, it is on YouTube, so yeah, be my guest. This whole torture scene also shows how Big Boss loses his eye, which is again kind of rough to sit through, ending in a chase scene where he has to leap from the top of a dam, which is obviously a reference to that one episode of The Simpsons.
Snake!
I'm telling you, I didn't do anything.
I don't care.
Yes, I'm kidding. I know it's from The Fugitive. The only consolation is that you do get your revenge on this guy because he serves as one of the final bosses, and you have to take him on not once, not twice, but thrice. Yeah, so first you have to beat him in a straight up fight, which, to be honest, is tough enough. But then after that, there's a lengthy chase sequence where you're also being chased by the Shagahod, only to then have to take this thing on directly with an RPG. But even then, that's not the end of it, because Volgan jacks into the side of this thing by punching through its outer shell, at which point you can finally take him down when he's fully exposed. Kinda reminds me of those final Liquid Snake fights in MGS1, like how you first had that fight against Metal Gear Rex, then the fist fight on top of it before that final Jeep chase where Liquid tanks about a bazillion machine gun rounds. And then, even after all that is done, you've still got to escort Eva through this final patch of the jungle, which admittedly is probably one of the worst sections in the game. And then you can take on the boss for the final showdown, so yeah, it really just keeps going on and on there.
I'll give you 10 minutes.
That's what she said!
When you watch people speedrun MGS3, like almost a quarter, if not a third of the entire run is taken up with these final sequences, which should really tell you how long the whole thing goes on for. And just like all good Metal Gear Solid bosses, Volgan makes sure to yell out Snake's name just moments before he cucks it.
Snake!
Which is honestly like some kind of unwritten law for these guys. So yeah, Kojima really cemented this guy as one of the baddest dudes in the entire franchise. And his appearance is still pretty damn unique, which is really saying something. In the same game series where you've got a character with a Tommy gun who can shoot hornets out of his dick hole. When it comes to how the whole thing looks, it's without a doubt another really impressive entry, combining what was cutting-edge graphics for the PS2 at the time, along with Kojima's trademark knack for creating highly cinematic and memorable cutscenes. All of this stuff is again completely motion captured, making it feel like you're watching an actual movie at times, with properly trained actors to bring the whole thing together. And yeah man, check out the weapon they hired to do all the gunslinging mocap for Ocelot. And really some of the best cinematics are those earlier ones, like seeing Ocelot get new shit pushed in by both Snake and Eva. The scenes with the pain and his literal swarm of hornets is also just downright impressive, considering the limitation of the PS2 as a console. And then just the basic weather effects like rain, fog and water are also really ahead of their time. In the second half of the game, once Snake has lost his eye, whenever you aim in first person mode, there's a vignette effect highlighting his newfound handicap and loss of depth perception. Plus you've got all those various effects for things like the night vision and the thermal goggles, along with weapon scopes capturing the rustic feel of the 1960s era weaponry and tech. Then of course you've got the theme tune, yeah, that theme tune. Not only the best theme tune in the entire series, but without a doubt one of the best theme tunes in any kind of medium ever. Epitomized with what might be the only singing ladder in known existence. I still remember watching that early E3 demo for the first time, and that chorus dropping as Cynthia Harrell's vocals kicked in, it still puts goosebumps on my arms and a tingle in my balls. About the only thing I don't like that much is the new game over screen, which does fit the time period, but the absence of that iconic jingle from MGS1 and parts of MGS2 felt kinda hard.
What's going on? Snake! Snake!
What's also cool about the third game is that it's the first game in the series where each boss got their own unique fight theme. In MGS 1 and 2, it was the same track just used for more or less every single boss fight, which did take away a bit of the individuality from those encounters. But here in MGS 3, they're all completely unique for each character, and yet does make them seem much more memorable. The Furious theme, for instance, is this constantly shifting melody of brass instruments and jazz guitar, and it captures the vibe perfectly of fighting a super pissed off guy in a flameproof suit, who has the ability to lose his shit at a moment's notice and jet across the area covering it in flames.
The flames of my rage will incinerate you.
Having said all of that though, there is like a slight sense of diminishing returns with the presentation. Not that it's a bad thing, but it's kind of like comparing a 64 Mustang to a 65 Mustang.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the jump between both MGS1 and MGS2 might be one of the biggest leaps, I think, of all time when it comes to graphics, along with maybe Wolfenstein 3D to Doom or GTA 2 to GTA 3. In terms of what Konami pulled off when you compare those first two games back to back, it is absolutely night and day, and staggering to consider that those two were only 3 years apart. MGS2 and MGS3, on the other hand, are now 4 years apart, but those improvements are much less noticeable, which was always going to be the case when you consider that they're on the same console. Now, that's not to say that it's not impressive, and MGS3 is without a doubt one of the best looking games for the platform, but it's just not quite as groundbreaking or jaw-dropping as MGS2 was after coming off the back of its PS1 predecessor. What it does have though is that timeless mid-2000s era aesthetic going for it, and there's a reason why so many games from this time period still look that good, even by today's standards, back when art direction trumped technical limitations, and yeah, what a time to be alive. What MGS3 also does exceptionally well is really make you feel like you're out there in the middle of the jungle, where it gets worse here every day. With countless hazards like crocodiles, quicksand, traps, and enemy soldiers to avoid. 2004 was also the year when jungle environments in video games really started to take off, and I don't know what it was about this year in particular, but it just seemed like something clicked with developers and these environments started becoming that much more believable and immersive. I mean, consider the fact that this is the year when Far Cry launched, where the jungles in that game were so realistic that you could practically feel the mosquitoes on your arms while you were playing. So for Metal Gear Solid 3, a console game on the PS2, to also capture that same feeling, it's pretty damn impressive. And it looks even better if you're playing it with the HD collection. Yeah, I suppose we should probably talk about the fact that in 2011, Bluepoint Games remastered MGS2, 3, and Peace Walker for the PS3 and the Xbox 360. And that's what most of my footage here has been captured with. And I know that opinions on this thing can vary, but I do feel like the HD collection kind of renders the old PS2 version redundant. Mostly because of the improved resolution and frame rate, but also for another very important reason. And that's the inclusion of that more traditional third-person camera. I think a lot of people forget that back in the original, the camera still used that isometric top-down perspective, which was the same thing in MGS 1 and 2, and yeah, it worked fine in those games, mostly because you had an actual radar and the areas were mostly small and interior. But in MGS 3, you're in these wide, opened-up jungle environments, and that fixed camera outright prevents you from seeing ahead at times, and combined with a complete lack of a radar, it means you literally can't see what's coming. At some point though, Konami realized how dumb it was and added in what we now know as a traditional third-person camera into the MGS3 Substance Edition, which then served as the basis for the HD collection all those years later. And let me tell you man, that's a good thing because that old camera perspective is god-awful and an outright handicap in certain areas. And look, anyone who says differently hasn't tried beating the end on a European extreme run. I guess my point is that if you are going to play this, which I do recommend, you're absolutely better off doing it with the HD collection, and ideally on the PS3, not the 360, because to me, something about playing an MGS game with an Xbox controller just seems wrong.
I wouldn't be so sure if I were you.
Or of course, just wait for that Master Collection due out later this year, and hope Konami don't go all Grove Street Games on it. As for the gameplay, well, this is definitely the most tactical of the tactical espionage action that we'd gotten up until that point. And the way that I describe MGS3 is that it's an easy game to pick up and play, but one that's incredibly challenging to master. On the surface, it's the same as it's always been. You run around these various environments trying to not get spotted by enemies, using a combination of the third-person view and then first-person aiming. You give them the option to go lethal or non-lethal, with there still being absolute bugger all options there for the latter. And ghosting entirely is also possible, reserved for those with the absolute biggest wangs of all. Silenced weapons are still a thing, but now silencers break after a certain amount of shots, which means you don't have this perpetually silent sleep gun anymore that can knock out enemies indefinitely. Instead, now you actually need to look out for replacement silencers, which aren't too common. MGS3 also adds in the CQC system, which is really just a fancy word for being able to grab someone and throw them to the ground. Yeah, if you've got the right weapon equipped, you can get up behind someone and shake them down for information, either hold them up at gunpoint for items, or just throw them to the ground like a hot bag of shit.
Freeze!
Being set in the 1960s, that magical omniscient radar system which shows you exactly where enemies are and even which way they're looking is completely gone, replaced with a much more basic motion detector. Enemies are also dressed in the proper attire with uniforms that make them blend into the backdrop, and it can be really tricky at first getting used to spotting them.
Who's that?
The consolation there is that they patrol a lot slower than they did before. In MGS2, enemies would circle around the room, keeping an eye on things at such a fast pace that it was almost like they'd taken a bump of the old booger sugar before they got on patrol shift. In MGS3 though, they move much slower, which in these jungle areas probably makes sense. I mean, someone power walking around a jungle doing laps of recon like that is likely to roll their ankle in a ditch or break their toe on a tree root. On top of that, your footsteps are much more audible now, and you can't just run right up behind someone like you could do in the last game. Now the enemy react to your footsteps and quickly spin around, and if you're not quick in dispatching them, it can go pear-shaped pretty quickly. So in a lot of ways, MGS3 was really the most skill-based game they'd made at that point, with it being way more than just staying out of someone's line of sight cone, and more about the stance you're in, whether it be standing, crouched, or fully prone, along with what kind of camouflage you were also wearing. Yeah, and of course, Snake Eater adds in the camouflage system, where you're constantly having to swap through different kinds of camo for Snake's uniform and face, often almost having to do it in every new area you enter. And the right camo in the right place can make all the difference, especially since there's no set distance where you can be spotted from anymore. So wearing something bright and loud in the middle of the jungle, you may as well put a neon sign above your head. All up, there's a couple of dozen of these in total, with a lot of them having to be found throughout the campaign, and others only unlocked by beating the bosses non-lethally. The only problem here, and something that sure isn't getting any better over time, is that swapping these out is this tedious process of pausing the game, going into that menu, selecting the right camo, equipping it, and then backing back out. Which does start to get a bit annoying after a while, to the point where I'd often just find like a middle of the road camo pattern and stick with that one instead. About the best improvement that MGS4 made was the way that they essentially reworked this idea with the Octo Camo suit, where all you had to do that time was stay still against a surface for like a second or so, and the suit would automatically adjust. Once you've got on the best possible uniform for your current surroundings, your camo index goes up to the point that you become near invisible. And enemies are often just going to walk right past you, and as Aragorn said in Lord of the Rings, to disappear entirely, that is a rare gift. So yeah, it's a pretty big new addition that has a profound effect on the overall gameplay, and the amount of exploits and perks on offer here with some of these uniforms and these other tricks is pretty staggering.
Damn it!
It's also one of the main reasons you're better off playing this game non-lethally. I mean, ignoring the fact that it's the proper way to play the game, but more so because beating all these bosses non-lethally is going to have them drop their own unique uniforms, which offer up some of the best benefits.
Now you will go to sleep, or I will put you to sleep.
Oh dear.
The camo you get from beating Ocelot, for instance, removes the hand sway when aiming, and the Sorrow's camo removes the sound of your footprints entirely. You can even find a prototype stealth suit near the end of the game, which is pretty much an earlier version of what Snake would wear in MGS1. So collecting all of these uniforms like they're Pokemon cards and hoarding them across playthroughs is a definite factor in the longevity you get out of the whole experience. And then combine all of this with those various ways you can mess around with the AI, and you can see how it becomes so addictive. And again, it kind of harkens back to what I said before, how the whole thing is a borderline immersive sim. Early on, you're taught that shooting hornets' nests will cause them to attack whoever's standing nearby, and that's a tactic that works throughout the entire campaign. If you blow up any of the food storage buildings and then head into a nearby area, you'll hear enemy soldiers commenting on how hungry they are, and even hear their stomachs growling.
So long.
In fact, it actually segues pretty well into one of the most important new mechanics, and that's the game's entire namesake, which is being able to find and eat food. You can't just rely on eating magical ration packs anymore to restore your health. Instead, health restores slowly over time, and a big part of speeding that process up comes from eating everything that's not nailed down. In MGS2, about the only time that stamina ever came into play was during the boss fights, where using that M9 pistol would knock down a boss's stamina bar instead of their health. But now in MGS3, it's something that not only affects the boss fights, but also Snake, with this ever-dwindling stamina bar that drops over time depending on the weapons you're carrying, and also what even kind of injuries you've got. Yeah, son, take too many bullets, or fall off something too high, or get too close to any open flames, and you'll have to treat your wounds accordingly. You can even get bitten by spiders, snakes, or scorpions, or catch food poisoning from rotten food that sat in your inventory for too long. In fact, I still remember the first time I took a break from playing MGS3 all those years ago to go off and, I think, win the Sex World Championship, if I recall correctly, only to come back a few days later and find all of my food had gone about as rotten as the inside of a teenage boy's gym sock.
That was poison.
One of the best new player traps in the game is early on when you're swimming through a crocodile and leeches infested swamp, and it's easy to not even realise that afterwards you're covered head to toe in the ladder, which drains your stamina faster than your mum drains nut sacks on a Friday night. Is that too far? There's even a certain infamous streamer who goes a good couple of hours without realising he's done this. If your stamina gets too low, it starts to cause your hands to sway when aiming weapons, and you'll even hear Snake's stomach growling and grumbling. So all the various bits of food you come across, from animals like bats, snakes, rabbits and fish, through to fruits and vegetables, all restore your stamina, along with having some funny responses from Snake when you eat them.
Pretty tasty.
Honestly, it's not that much of an issue on normal or even hard mode, but on very hard and up is when it becomes an actual thing you need to take care of, because at that point it's so much harder to get your health back in a pinch.
I'm gonna puke.
One of the best areas in the game that shows how all of this stuff comes together is a bit about halfway through the campaign where you have to climb up this mountainside to reach a cabin on the top. There's sentries patrolling around, as well as a chopper doing laps around the area to really keep you on your toes. But then you've also got a really good eye line to see off in the distance, and the verticality with the cliffside offers up some really fun ways to mess with the AI. There's even a machine gun placement in certain spots in case you want to go guns blazing and shoot down that annoying chopper. And if you kill someone in this area, nearby vultures are going to swoop in and start pecking at the carcasses. I feel like it just highlights every mechanic in Metal Gear Solid 3 at once. The concept of being aware of how visible you are to your enemies while you're moving up the mountain, monitoring your stamina as you make the climb, plus the choice the player constantly has between going for stealth or combat. And even if you are seen in this game, it's often more fun just to try to shoot your way out of things and see how long you can last. I will admit that I do miss that more tactical, squad-based AI from the second game though. One of the coolest things in MGS2 was the way that the enemies would search and clear a room that they thought the player was hiding in.
Clear!
You'd see these guys giving each other hand signals and other little signs to communicate without making any noise, and the way they check every little nook and cranny showed off a lot of realism and intelligence. Just kind of felt like when you were finally spotted that they were really sending in these elite units to deal with you specifically. You had a guy in the front with a riot shield, and then another with a shotgun for close encounters. And these guys meant fucking business. In comparison, the attacking enemies in MGS3 just kinda seem to come out of nowhere, and that squad of reinforcements is often just a couple of guys with riot shields who run right towards you. Guys who also keep their kneecaps laughably exposed. You could probably argue that being the 1960s and all that stuff, that military tactics weren't as advanced as they were during MGS2, but either way it always kinda stuck out to me, and the AI in this game really does become pretty damn easy to exploit. And a big part of why that's also the case is the sheer amount of weapons and toys you get to play with. Yeah, where does he get those wonderful toys? Now, despite non-lethal really being the patrician way to play the MGS games, MGS3 sure has a lot of different weapons to let you kill things with, and this might be the most combat-oriented lineup of guns outside of MGS4. For the pacifist, you're limited to either the MK22 pistol, which you will spend the vast amount of time using, and then eventually the end's most in nagging if you can get it. During those short stints when you're undercover as a scientist or an officer or something, you can put Q-branch to good use there and knock people out silently with sleeping gas or a handkerchief doused in a Bill Cosby cocktail. But these are much harder to use out there in the jungle, so you'll mostly be using that MK22 pistol, which may as well be a goddamn rifle because it's about as accurate as one. For combat though, well, there's a whole heap of explosives. You've got 2 assault rifles, an AK-47 and an M16. There's a Scorpion submachine gun, an RPG, a Dragunov sniper rifle, and even a goddamn shotgun, which is really one of the most underrated boomsticks in all of gaming. I mean, check it out.
Shotgun!
When you're detected, an alert is raised, obviously, and if that enemy's given enough time, they'll call in those reinforcements for backup. But it gets to the point where if you kill too many of them, the game just stops sending anyone else to attack you. Like they've just run out of disposable people, which really shows you that it caters for gamers who really want to take that Rambo approach. In fact, one of the weapons you get is a belt-fed machine gun, and when Snake fires it for too long, he even lets out a bit of a war cry, which is in no way inspired by a certain 1980s action hero. And then once you've beaten the story for the first time, you unlock the boss's Patriot gun, an assault rifle that just happens to have unlimited ammo, which completely breaks the game. But even without this thing, I feel like Metal Gear Solid 3 absolutely allows for combat, and in one of the best improvements, you no longer take segmented damage from automatic weapons. Yeah, it was like in the other games, if you ever got hit by any weapon, you'd always get interrupted from whatever you were doing, be it firing weapons or running away. Here though, automatic weapons do damage over time, which makes it much easier to fight back, without having control constantly taken away from you. It's just a much more sensible approach to being under gunfire, which was something that was long overdue for an update. What I would always do was make a new save file when I was ready to stop playing, but then I'd just go on like a murderous rampage until I was finally killed. Most of the time I just have to turn off the console instead because of how easy it is to bully the AI, but it really showed you how much fun the combat can be, and a part of me has always wondered what it might be like if Konami ever made a proper first-person shooter, considering that first-person aspect of the controls has always been so tight and refined. In fact, that's actually probably another reason why the HD collection is so much better, because it makes it objectively easy to see enemies off in the distance and get those all-important headshots. Now, when I look back at MGS 1 and 2, they're the kind of games where you can break them down into segments, instead of looking at it as being this one overarching experience, because they've all got those key moments which makes them so memorable. For MGS 1, you've got the shootout with Meryl, you've got fighting Ocelot, fighting Vulcan Raven in the tank, rappelling with the rope, the stealth guys in the elevator, and so forth. MGS 2 has the entirety of the tanker, defusing the bombs, fighting Fat Man, escorting and protecting Emma, and then that batshit insane finale inside Arsenal gear. Much in the same way, MGS 3 just feels like you're going from one mini set piece to the next. And like the members of Foxhound and Dead Cell, a lot of this comes from those really great boss fights.
But what fun would that be?
Seeing as this is set before the idea of Foxhound was even a tickle in someone's throat, this main rogue gallery of bad guys this time at the Cobra unit. Those former Special Forces soldiers who fought alongside the boss, and these guys are all meant to represent emotions that a soldier feels on the battlefield.
Do you hear me, Snake?
With it being pain, the fear, the end, the fury, and the sorrow. Yeah, man, with the real sorrow there being that dude's unfortunate receding hairline. And as someone who's also rapidly losing his own day by day, that's the emotion I relate to the most.
Like you, I too am filled with sadness.
God damn!
Some people have also theorized that they reflect the emotions that Snake goes through having to deal with the betrayal of his former mentor, which is why only after he's able to overcome all of them is he finally able to beat her in the finale. I don't know, either way though, it's the usual collection of freaks and weirdos you'd expect in a game made by Hideo Kojima. The first real combat encounter comes just after Snake meets Eva for the first time, when he's ambushed by the Ocelot unit, and this one is memorable because it's the first real set piece, but also because it really expects you to think outside of the box to succeed. You probably think you're better off holding them off from the room itself, but a trapdoor lets you sneak out underneath the building, which then opens up this whole world of opportunities. And it's a philosophy to the gameplay that flows across all of these ensuing combat sequences. After that, your first proper boss fight is with Ocelot, in a shootout which is like something out of a western, complete with the right music and even rolling tumbleweed. And you can beat this guy in numerous ways, from distracting him with hornets, throwing out stun grenades, or just shooting him. Then the first Cobra you encounter is the Pain, who admittedly is one of the easiest, because he stands on what may as well be a goddamn pedestal, making himself an easy target. But then you notice that he's got this small army of hornets that protect him from every attack. So what you gotta do here is scatter those hornets using the shotgun or grenades, at which point he becomes vulnerable. But even then, for a first time player, I mean, that's not something that everyone's gonna instantly recognize. The next one you fight is the Fear, a dude who has a serious hard-on for spiders and really seems to have based his entire personality around that.
Come into my web.
Slow down, egghead.
And as for fighting him, well, you can simply track him as he jumps from tree to tree and shoot at him, something which does become insanely easy with those thermal goggles. You can also drop poisonous food, which he'll run up to and eat when his stamina runs low.
It's poisoned!
Or what's without a doubt one of the funniest tricks in the entire game, in how you can pretend to be dead using a fake death pill.
Dead already?
Which leaves the guy wide open for one of the fastest and lamest exploits. And again, you know, not something everyone's going to figure out on their own, and surely not on their first playthrough. The end, however, is the apex of the whole experience, and is without a doubt the most interesting one out of the bunch. It's a really intensive one-on-one sniper battle with this decrepit old veteran marksman who's hiding out in different areas of the forest. And I'm not even sure if I'd say this guy's a villain. I mean, he's just some poor old grizzled soldier who wants to die against someone who can actually put up a proper fight.
You have my thanks.
He was the best guy around.
What about the people he murdered?
What murder?
And he's even nice enough to use tranquilizer darts instead of actual bullets.
Freeze.
But this fight right here, man, this fight right here, it absolutely stumped me the first time I played it. And I reckon I would have spent maybe 2 or 3 hours trying to figure out how to beat him. There is just so much stuff going on during this fight, having to track this guy across multiple areas. And the rumor that Kojima originally wanted this fight to last for weeks really doesn't seem that far-fetched, when the likelihood of people taking weeks to beat him anyway doesn't seem that far off. What's even funny though is that when you know what to do, he's probably one of the easiest bosses in the entire game. Basically what you need to do is first find his location on the map and track his position, and that can be done in a few ways. If you've got those thermal goggles, you can follow his footprints, again, showing just how important those things are. And if you've got that directional mic, you can even listen in for his breathing to ascertain what direction he's in as well.
This is the end.
You can even just keep an eye out for the glare from the sun hitting the scope of his rifle. And if you hit, the direction the dart has hit your body is more or less like a compass marker. So there's just so many little tricks which make this guy so memorable and fun to engage with. And even something simple like leaving the area and coming back has him welcome you back to the fight like he's talking directly to the player.
Welcome back, Snake. I've been waiting for you.
He was the best guy around.
Probably the most famous trick is just killing him earlier in the game and bypassing the showdown entirely, which is the kind of tactic that only people whose parents don't love them would ever use.
We're being attacked.
And then even more of a bitch move is saving the game, moving your console clock forward like a week, at which point the guy just dies of old age. Though that does feature one of the best walking away and not looking at an explosion moments of all time. When I complained about the BB unit in my MGS4 video, this boss right here is the reason I was doing it. Because the point of comparison to the BB unit is a guy like this, a seemingly demigod with a sniper rifle who talks to birds and uses photosynthesis to recover his wounds. Going from the Cobra unit in MGS3 to the BB unit in MGS4 is like watching a Deep Purple concert and then following it up with Taylor Swift. Anyway, after that is the Fury, a boss who at one point I found to be the absolute hardest one in the game, but now I kind of find to be pretty easy. This guy is the absolute personification of gamer rage embodied in a boss fight. He's a former astronaut who suffered what I can only imagine is some pretty heavy duty trauma, and now walks around in a flight suit welding a goddamn flamethrower.
fury.
He's the closest thing we've got to Darth Vader in this game, outside of maybe Snake, because when his ship re-entered Earth's atmosphere, it burst into flames, giving him third-degree burns across his entire body. Now he has to wear this suit to survive, and yeah, I get it, that'd piss me off too. So during the fight, he runs around the arena talking a bunch of shit, while slowly getting more and more pissed off as he realizes he's losing. Sounds familiar.
Fucking getting sick of this fucking shit!
It's just another really memorable sequence that reminds me a lot of the Vulcan Raven showdown in MGS1, putting you in a kinda similar looking area, only now with the added tension of a jetpack wearing psychopath who's got the ability to get from one end of the room to the other in literal seconds.
My flight suit is ripped.
Yeah, they'll do that.
And not only again can use the environment to your advantage using darker uniforms to remain hidden, but also quite literally cut that suit to pieces with your knife, which does insane damage. Then finally we've got the Sorrow, and this guy isn't even a boss fight in the traditional sense. Instead, he confronts you in some kind of dream state with the tormented spirits of all the people you've killed so far. And I dare say that if the message boards on game FAQs didn't exist all those years ago, well, I don't think I would have ever possibly beaten this guy. In a series that's always found a way to work in these short horror-based sequences, this encounter with the Sorrow is a definite highlight, along with the image of seeing a naked man cartwheel while cupping his balls with his hands.
I'm sorry. Sorry to bring this up during the mission.
So all up, in the annals of MGS boss history, along with the likes of Foxhound and Dead Cell, the Cobra unit definitely earned their place amongst those ranks, and that's not even including the boss or Volgan. What also makes them memorable, I think, in a lot of ways, is that they really do foreshadow Snake's ultimate transformation into becoming Big Boss, and his eventual turning point into becoming a private soldier. I mean, all the members of the Cobra unit are literal war heroes. They helped the Allied forces fight back during World War II, even turning the tide of the fight at Normandy. So as far as the history books are concerned, these guys are legends, but they're legends that their country disowned and discarded, even going so far as to plant bombs in all of them in case they were ever captured. For all intents and purposes, despite their skill set and success rate, they were still treated as expendable people. And Snake's realization of that also plays a big part in why he also loses sight of what it means to be a soldier. By the end of the game, we see him as pretty much a broken man, someone who has become completely disillusioned with not only his entire country, but also his own existence. And yeah, how do I talk about MGS3 without mentioning that ending?
Are you crying? What's that? Are you crying? Am I crying? No, I'm not crying. You're crying.
The ending for Metal Gear Solid 3 is absolutely up there as one of the toughest, most emotional endings in any form of media. And when you learn the real reason for why the boss did what she did, it becomes even more heartbreaking.
It's okay to cry. People cry.
The boss even serves as the final boss when everything else is said and done, and this final encounter is a test of absolutely everything you've learned so far. Plus also in pretty stark contrast to what you've just gone through. From a literal war zone to a quiet, serene showdown in a field of white flowers in a fight to the death against your old mentor. If you take too long here, an instrumental version of the main theme starts to kick in, and a part of me almost wishes like this would play from the beginning because it really makes the whole experience even more immersive. Then once everything is done and dusted, you spend the next 15 minutes or so finding out the truth about what's really going on, and to say it's a gut punch is an understatement.
There is nothing left inside me now. Nothing at all. No hatred, not even regret.
Now look, there's only a few times in a man's life when he's allowed to cry. One of those is during the birth of his child, another one is during the ending for Iron Giant, and another one of those is during the ending for Metal Gear Solid 3. And if the sight of one of the most manliest, badass super soldiers to ever grace the medium, breaking down into tears at the grave of someone who's more or less his mother, doesn't reduce you to a quivering wreck, well, you might not actually be human.
She was a true patriot.
What is this salty discharge?
It even hits harder than watching Snake and Ocelot settle the score in MGS4, or the final graveyard scene with Big Boss, which funnily enough also has a very similar backdrop.
This is good, isn't it?
Oh my God, you're crying.
And that's the reason why whenever I see Kojima doing something stupid, or I hear more disappointing news about a project he's working on or not working on, I just keep telling myself that this is the guy who wrote the ending for Metal Gear Solid 3. The best video games are the ones that linger in your head after you've stopped playing, the ones you still think about when the console is off, unplugged and gathering dust. The ones you end up coming back to time and time again to try and recapture that magic you felt all those years ago, and the ones that inevitably hit all those highs and lows.
Pretty good.
People still talk about how much they love MGS3 almost 2 decades after it first came out, and they're still going to be talking about it another 2 decades from now as well. The series might have lost its way in the recent years and become all but abandoned by Konami for a while there, but to deny the cultural impact this stuff has had on the industry is just ignorant.
I'm glad to hear that.
With the upcoming remake no doubt doing its best to recapture that same magic, it'll still never change just how good and influential this original is. From the writing, the characters, the music and the backdrop through to the tactical espionage action. As a total package, it's wildly unrivaled, and it's a game that taught me that sometimes you just need to feed on a tree frog.